Hello, my name is Megan and I'm a counselor. I'm here to talk with you guys a little bit today about our role as counselors within the school. So, in short, our role as a counselor in the school setting is vital for our students' success in the classroom and also in the home. So, I'm going to break this down into a few different areas to better explain myself. So, first of all, we have the school psychologist role. The school psychologist role is essentially to complete all of the assessments and measurements and tests needed for students to be afforded an IEP. An IEP is an educational plan that is individualized. So, an IEP is an individualized education plan. This education plan allows these students to have certain accommodations and services made for them specifically for their needs, whether that is a learning disability or an emotional disability. And these can range between 15 pages to I've seen some that are up to 40. So the school psychologist is the one who will determine what tests need to be completed because there is different tests that are done for each student. Primarily, there is a full scale IQ test that is done, a math comprehension, math processing, reading, word processing, word memory, and a couple of things that go into the area of academia in order to decide if that student does or does not have a learning disability. So the school psychologist has a standardized packet of different tests that they use in order to assess if the child does or does not have a learning disability. For the emotional component, there are other tests that go into this. They look for ADHD, so they may do a Connors test, and that is something that the teacher fills out, the student fills out, as well as the parent. They also do scales looking for anxiety, social anxiety, test anxiety, as well as depression. Other areas of emotional disabilities that school psychologists particularly look at are also their social connections. Are they able to make friendships in appropriate ways with appropriate peers and learn in the learning environment with those peers? So peer relations is a huge component of IEPs. If the student, say for instance, the student has an IQ of 102 and they're able to process math, reading, and words at the appropriate grade level, then they would not be afforded an IEP per their learning disability. However, if their emotional disability is so great that their social relations are so poor, their ability to conform to peer norms, their ability to handle their aggression or their anxiety or their ADHD inside the classroom would keep them from learning. Therefore, they would be afforded an IEP specifically for their emotional disability. So, the school psychologist is responsible for all of those tests. And as counselors, we are fortunate enough not to have to run all those tests, score them, and then present that information as one person, because that's hours and hours and hours of work. However, as counselors, we can certainly speak to the different types of struggles that the child may have pertaining to their emotional stability, their peer relationships, or their sociability inside the classroom, as well as issues they may have in the community at large as well. We know that if the child is worried about where their next meal is going to come from, or if they're at home caring for 4 younger siblings and trying to get food on the table, their dinner, or their schoolwork rather, is going to be the least important thing on their mind. And as counselors, if we are fortunate enough to hear our clients' struggles about their home life, then we can absolutely speak and advocate for more resources for them and then work in tangent with the social worker if our school can afford a social worker. So, this is a long and drawn out answer. Because although we do not necessarily pick which test may be ran per the school psychologist, we can certainly still advocate for our clients and decide and make referrals for they may be struggling with depression, they may be struggling with an adjustment disorder, they may be witnessing domestic violence at home, so perhaps they have components of post-traumatic stress disorder. And then you or we could make behavioral accommodations for them as necessary. So, okay, so we have the school psychologist role, and they pick the battery of tests and measurements and assessments that are kind of already in a packet, very convenient for them to start the test and measurements for these children. The counselor can make suggestions as far as their emotional intelligence goes and their emotional inability goes. Okay, so now once all of those tests are completed and the psychologist has had some time to score all of them, he or she would then write their report. The social worker would also then write their report if the school has a social worker. The counselor of the school would also write their report, speaking to their cognitive ability, their ability to have social relations and peer relations, and how they can handle stress in school. Are they able to tolerate much stress? Are they able to handle their anxiety when given a test? Things to that nature. The social worker would really speak to their sociability as well as, is this child in need of other resources, such as, do they need resources or referrals for a food pantry or WIC, or is there other kind of state aid that the parents may really benefit from in order to best care for this child? So each person has a very valuable and important role in the child's life in these meetings. So the next part of an IEP specifically is all of the professionals come together in team collaboration to make the most efficient, most effective, and best services available for the student. If the student obtains an IEP specifically for a learning disability, then their accommodations are going to look much different, well, somewhat different, than if the child has a learning disability with an emotional disability, or if the child has solely an emotional disability. In my area, we are fortunate to have enough to have several different programs. So we have a self-contained classroom specifically for children with learning disabilities. We then have a separate program specifically for children with emotional disabilities. So here, the classroom is very much structured through the work of the counselor, the social worker, and the special education teacher. And yes, those children would still be afforded a special education teacher, even though they do not have a learning disability. The reason for this is because the children in this classroom learn differently than your normal or typical functioning teenager or child. So, in this classroom, the counselor often works in tandem with the social worker and the special ed teacher in order to create a structured, safe learning environment that caters to the students' emotional needs, that also gives them emotional support. So part of the individualized education plan is something called a behavioral interventions. So this is, what would Susie have if she was to escalate during a test and become aggressive? there would be certain things lined out in her individualized education plan that would help her to get safely out of the classroom, get the support that she needs from the counselor, the social worker, or the psychologist, whom would be available at that time, to keep her from getting disciplinary write-ups, and then to get her back safely into the classroom. And all of this is based off of all of the reports that the school psychologist writes. So, the measurements done by the school psychologist are very vital for our role as counselors in a school. So, to backtrack a little bit. Okay, so I spoke about our role and how it's very important for the success of our students in the school and outside of the school. I spoke a little bit about how the measurements for the school psychologist are really their choice, and they are very well trained in this, and there's already a set kind of go-to packet that they use for these tests. In addition, counselors can make suggestions for additional testing. So the other part of this is who's all involved in writing educational plans. So, and how they actually look in the classroom. And the other part of this is the IEP meetings. And why would we need to know about any of these tests, or why these tests are important, or how do they even relate to us? So, the individualized education plan meetings are held each semester. So the first semester, towards the beginning of the school year, a meeting is held with the school psychologist, the counselor, the social worker, a teacher who the child really identifies with, and a teacher who perhaps the child has a lot of trouble with. Anecdotally, it's the gym teacher, because kids with emotional disabilities have a hard time in unstructured settings, especially where kids are pretty rowdy, it's very loud, most gyms echo, so kids typically have a very hard time regulating their moods and emotions and behaviors in gym class. In my experience, it's usually the gym teacher that comes to these to speak about the difficulty the child has. So that's just for an example. So you have two teachers, the special ed teacher, the counselor, the social worker, the psychologist, the student, the parent or parents, and then typically an administrator, as well as the special education coordinator. So these meetings, there's a lot of people in there, and you have to get through much information in a very short amount of time. Typically, we only have an hour to get through very much information. So the psychologist will quickly go through his report, state what the full scale IQ is, what their strength is, what their weakness is. If they do or do not have a learning disability, and where they fall on the range, if they do. The other part is they will speak to the tests that were done per their emotional disability. So they would speak to if they do have an emotional disability, where their shortcomings are, where they struggle. So for example, that the child is okay academically, but because their emotional disability is so severe, it keeps them from learning. Therefore, they need a special education plan devised to help them to be successful. So the psychologist oftentimes hands this information to me or to another counselor. If the school doesn't have one, then it would be an outsourced psychologist or an outsourced counselor. So the psychologist quickly runs through this information. The social worker quickly runs through his information. The special ed teacher quickly goes through how Susie is doing in the classroom. And most of this is very strength based. It's very much focused on what's the child's strengths, and not as much geared as what is their area to improve, because we want the child to walk out of this room feeling that they're supported and not defeated. So because of the little time that is available during these meetings, the child may not fully understand what their services are, what all of these scores mean, or even what is an emotional disability and why are they special ed. The parent may have additional questions as well. So as counselors, we can very much speak to what those emotional disabilities are, what the accommodations are in the classroom per that IEP, what additional services they can have outside in the community, and also what additional services they can receive in the school. However, if we are not knowledgeable on the tests that the psychologists have given and scored and evaluated, we are not able to market ourselves as speaking to this kind of expert level information. It makes us much more marketable to know about evaluations, assessment, tests, and scoring in order to help facilitate a team atmosphere in our schools with the psychologist, the social worker, the special education teacher, as well as, and most importantly, the child and their parents. We can spend that additional time providing them with emphatic support, unconditional positive regard, and really trying to foster this relationship with the parents so that they feel comfortable in knowing that the school has a very solid hold on where their child is struggling and where their child is exceeding. If we are not knowledgeable in this areas of deficiencies, we are doing a disservice to our clients and to the parents who are caring for these children. If we are not knowledgeable about their deficiencies, then we would struggle therapeutically on how best to help them as well. If a child has an IQ of 75, traditional talk therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy may not be the best route for them. Whereas a child with an IQ of 105, play therapy may not be appropriate for them. So it really is part of our responsibility to understand the measurements and tests that the psychologists run and be able to speak to them fluently to our students, the other staff, the parents, as well as our responsibility as therapists in the school. So this is a very long, drawn-out answer. It isn't easily summarized in just a couple sentences, but I hope that this short film has been helpful on our role as counselors in the school and why it's important for us to know what a school psychologist is doing. If you have any other questions, please feel free to let me know. Thank you.